Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another week of brews here. I'm Conley. This is TCGplayer.com. This week, we are bringing you a near mono blue, splashing a little black, Metallurgic Summonings / Dynavolt Tower deck. Everybody probably saw Dynavolt Tower perform at the Pro Tour. It's a pretty sick little engine that turns your spells into lightning bolts eventually by converting energy into lightning bolts. And I wanted to give it a shot with a little bit more of a heavy spell deck with more disruption and with the ability to kind of go over the top of other control decks. One of the things that I noticed that most of the other control decks in the Pro Tour and in the Grand Prix following have been lacking is hand disruption. So it seemed like a good way to get a leg up is to just play more counter magic, play more hand disruption, and if you can skate through the early game against aggro, then you'll be fine. So my list is exactly that, and we focus around Dynavolt Tower heavily, and then we have 2 copies of Metallurgic Summonings, which does a couple of things. A, it works as a win condition and gives you a bunch of threats, artifact threats, and then B, it works as a gigantic card advantage engine. You turn those threats, and you turn the Dynavolt Towers and the Torrential Gearhulk artifacts into mattering, because once you get 6 artifacts, usually a bunch of 2/2s and stuff, you can bring back your whole graveyard. You're often going to just win by just making a bunch of XXs, but the returning things from the graveyard is nice anyway. You also have Confirmed Suspicions, which is probably your cheatiest way to get to a bunch of artifacts because it makes 3 clues for you. So like 3 clues plus the 5/5 from Metallurgic Summonings plus the Dynavolt Tower or 2, and you're already able to trigger it. Besides those cards, though, everything else here, sort of what you would expect. We have 4 copies of Anticipate, just great finding lands and whatever spells you need and triggering all your spells matter stuff. 2 copies of Horribly Awry to give us some way to relieve pressure in the early game against creature-based decks. It's just a remove soul for 4 drops or less, but it does exile the creature, which is nice against the Delirium decks. 2 copies of Aether Meltdown. This I'm trying it out as the new kind of blue removal spell. I think it's pretty good. It hits Copter, which this deck has a huge issue against otherwise. As you can see, there's really nothing in the main deck that deals with Copter outside of Dynavolt Tower, which takes a while to get going. So Aether Meltdown is kind of a concession to Copter, and I expect to bring in the other 2 Aether Meltdowns against Copter decks and against aggro in general. The 2 energy also does matter. As I pointed out, we have Dynavolt Tower, so it's not going to waste. And yeah, I think overall this is probably going to be a reasonable card, but I definitely want to test it out. 3 copies of Collective Brutality, the 4th on the board. This is your kind of do everything card. Hits aggro creatures, duresses control decks, gives you some life when you're beating down. Like I said, just does everything. One of the main reasons to be black. And then 4 copies of Transgress the Mind, which I think is a better overall hand disruption card than Collective Brutality. It hits Aether Marvelworks, which is a huge combo deck right now. It hits opposing Dynavolt Towers. It hits opposing Torrential Gearhulks, or Gearhulks of all kinds. It hits opposing Glimmer of Genius, which obviously Collective Brutality does as well. But it just covers a huge swath. Hits Emrakul. It covers a huge swath, and I think is a good reason to splash black in your mono blue deck. 4 copies of Void Shatter, probably the best counterspell in Standard. Exiling things matters. People are playing 1 mana counter a colorless card, but we have 4 copies of Dynavolt Tower, 4 copies of Void Shatter, 2 copies of Horribly Awry, and 4 copies of Transgress. So unless we want to cut all those, we're going to be weak to that to some degree anyway. So for now, I'm just throwing caution to the wind and playing 4 copies of Void Shatter. Tower we talked about. 4 copies of Engulf the Shore. This is my sort of aggro reset. It's an instant, so you can cast it off a Torrential Gearhulk, which is kind of nice because you can play your Gearhulk, engulf the shore, bounce your Gearhulk and all of your opponent's creatures, replay your Gearhulk, and cast a Glimmer of Genius at the end of your opponent's turn, which is a pretty nice little sequence. Again, you end up with a lone 5/6 that gets a free attack in, and you get to draw some cards in addition to your engulf the shore. So that's kind of sweet. Also, you would get Dynavolt triggers for each of those sequences if that mattered. But yeah, beyond that, Engulf the Shore is just kind of your reset button. You play a Dynavolt Tower, you play something like Dynavolt Tower on turn 3, and you really want to reset the board on turn 4 and get a little bit of traction with your energy going. So Engulf the Shore does exactly that. So we're giving it a shot as kind of the main way we're going to be able to beat aggro in our main deck. Because we have Thing in the Ice in the sideboard because it is not an instant or sorcery, so it doesn't necessarily work with Metallurgic Summonings or Glimmer. Engulf does have a slightly awkward interaction with Metallurgic Summonings in the late game, where you really don't want to cast it. But at that point, we do have things like Collective Brutality to throw away Engulf the Shores, or we could just hold it for later on. 4 copies of Glimmer Genius, probably the best draw spell we've seen in Standard in quite a while. I love this card, and it's great in this deck. The energy matters. Yeah, everything's great about it. Confirm Suspicions. I already mentioned what it does. The counterspell part's quite relevant. Giving us artifacts is quite relevant. Being a little bit of card advantage in the late game is quite relevant. Just all around great card. 1 copy of Torrential Gearhulk to flashback all of our awesome blue instances. Does not flashback sorceries. I'm about to say sorceries, but it does not. Mana base is pretty straightforward. 4 Choked Estuary, 4 Sunken Howls, which count as islands. 1 swamp, 4 evolving wilds, and then a bunch of islands. So if you look at it, we actually only have 5 lands that are going to sit and play that aren't islands. 4 choked estuary and 1 swamp. Everything else is going to turn into an island or be an island. So our Engulfed Shores are pretty strong despite being a 2-color deck. And we still have access to 13 black sources for our 7 black cards. Sideboard, more of what you would expect. Like I said, a couple Aether Meltdowns against Copter decks. 4 Thing in the Ice against fast aggro decks. It gives us more access to Engulf the Shore type of effects, and also a 0/4 blocker on turn 2, which is nice. 2 copies of Negate for against control and mid-range. 2 copies of Dispel against control. These could also be the counter a colorless spell card if you want. I think our matchup against the Aetherworks Marvel decks is going to be strong enough that we don't necessarily need it, and we can run Dispel, which is going to counter things like Glimmer of Genius, which is important, and other counter spells. So I like Dispel a little bit better, but you have your option. 1 Confiscation Coup. We got energy. This seemed like a good way to fight opposing Dynavolt Tower decks and things like that. Is a 1 of. 1 Summary Dismissal. This doesn't work great with Gearhulk on the stack. It doesn't work great with Dynavolt Tower triggers or Metallurgic Summoning triggers on the stack, so I only have 1 copy of it. But we might want more just because it does deal with Emrakul. I think we have enough ways to hit Emrakul between the 4 Transgress in the main deck, 2 Pick the Brains coming in from the sideboard, and then also the Summary Dismissal. So I would hope we have enough ways to actually fight Emrakul without needing too many of this, but it's here for exactly that reason. 2 Pick the Brains to come in and be more hand disruption against the right decks, and then the last Collective Brutality, again, more hand disruption, more aggro stopping. It kind of just comes in wherever it makes sense. But yeah, that is the deck. Pretty straightforward, but it should play pretty fun and pretty deep. The game should go pretty long, and it's about as controlling as this format will allow, with very few win conditions, Dynavolt Tower being the primary one, Metallurgic Summonings being the secondary one, and then Gearhulk being kind of tertiary. But yeah, let's suit it up, give it a go. I don't want to talk too much more. So for TCGplayer.com, I'm Conley Woods. We'll be right back with Metallurgic Summonings, Dynavolt Tower, Blue-Black Control.